Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Yes, today is a very special day. We're remembering a very special man, Professor Sultan Hameed. We're going to have time to go through some remembrances later, but I've been here 25 years. Sultan was one of the first people I've met, and needless to say, I probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him. And so he really was an amazing guy. And for those who don't know, he was one of the founders of atmospheric sciences at Stony Brook back in the day, the 1970s, when we were mechanical engineering at the time, main campus, just getting going. So Mark Geller's here. He's going to give some history about this, so I won't go too much into those details. But and I'll say a few more words later. But I wanted to transition to our special seminar speaker. Professor Nicole Reimer, which is like a homecoming for us here. Nicole was actually here as assistant professor from about 2005 to 2007. So that's why it's a homecoming. It's a very sad day when she left here for Illinois. I remember that day.
Come back at
but that's a side story. But anyhow, so she's a full professor at the University of Illinois. They're in the Department of Climate, Meteorology, and Atmospheric Sciences. A little bit more about Nicole. She got her master's PhD in meteorology at the University of Karlsruhe, Germany. She did some postdoc work at Stanford and UC Davis before coming to Stony Brook here. And she was here between 2005 and 2007. And then went over to the University of Illinois and worked up the ranks to full professor. And she's been that since 2019. As you'll hear today, she's a world expert in aerosols, important for climate and clouds and many other things. And she's published over 90 publications. And given her expertise, she's been editor of Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics, editor of Aerosol Sciences and Technology, and she's a current editor for Journal of Geophysical Research.
Thanks to Minghua.
There we go. And given her accomplishments, she actually won the AGU Ascent Award 2021, which is a very high accomplishment. You'll hear today she's an excellent speaker and teacher. She's won teaching awards there at the University of Illinois. So very impressive list of accomplishments. So I was so happy she accepted this offer here to come speak. So let's welcome Nicole.
Okay. Well, thank you, Brian, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. This is a very special day for me as well. As you may know, Sultan was a mentor here for me when I was a fresh assistant professor. And the three things that I would say describe Sultan, and maybe we can brainstorm later what this is for you, is he was very curious, he was very calm, and he was a lifelong learner. And this really impressed me. And it's what I'm trying to instill in the people I'm mentoring now as well. Okay, so now figuring out my things here going forward. Yeah, so Sultan is a mentor, colleague, and our friend. I want to switch before, so yeah, hang on 1 second. My script here, so I kind of have to do two talks, thinking about Sultan and thinking about my own work. And so where I want to start is actually when I joined this department, as Brian mentioned, in 2005, now 20 years ago. He came to my office and said, "You're working on aerosols." I said, "Yes." And then he said, "I've been reading these papers." So Sultan was always reading many papers, as you know. He was a very well-read person. And he said, "There are these papers on dust." Yes, there are papers on dust. And so what he was referring to, now switching to my movie here, was this phenomenon right here. So this is a movie that was published by NASA some time ago now. And it really shows the global burden of atmospheric aerosols. And the different colors are different types of aerosols. And does anyone want to make a guess what this brown plume is that is going from the Sahara over the Atlantic? That's the dust, exactly. And so Sultan was reading these papers that dust is transported from the source, from the Sahara, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, arriving in the Americas. And so why this is important? Well, dust as a type of aerosol impacts the radiative balance of the atmosphere. So it influences how warm the sea surface temperature is. It influences how hurricanes are evolving, actually. It's important as a fertilizer in the Amazon, so it's important for biogeochemicals. And it impacts the air quality over on the other side. And so he was reading papers that describe there's a lot of variability of this dust arriving from or coming from one end here, arriving at the other end. And so he was curious what governs this variability. And so there are different reasons why the amount of dust that you get in the Americas varies. One is the source strength might change, right? But the other reason why the amount of dust in the Americas can vary is the transport, right? And so this brings me back to one of these ideas that Sultan moved forward, the centers of action. And I should say, at that time, I was more like a process modeler of aerosol particles. I wasn't necessarily thinking about long-range transport. So Sultan really taught me how to think big, how to think about long-range impacts, and how this connects to the patterns in the atmosphere. And so this shows one of the papers that we published and a figure from this paper. So the centers of actions are the semi-permanent pressure centers in the atmosphere. And so here we see two, the Azores High and the Hawaiian High. There are a few others. And so you can imagine, depending on where these pressure centers are situated, so they move around somewhat, this really governs where the dust or other aerosols are going and how much we actually receive on the outside of this path, even if the emissions are the same from year to year. So there's a lot of variability introduced by where these pressure centers are situated. And the beauty of this concept is it's very simple. So that was another thing that Sultan did really well, distilling things down to the essence here. Okay, and so we had a few papers coming out of this. We're fortunate to have a very good student joining our team. So this is Owen Doherty. He couldn't make it here. He would have wanted to be here, but because of the flight chaos, his flight was canceled. He's online on Zoom. And so this became part of his PhD thesis. And there was a series of papers that we published on this topic, centers of action and the impact on dust transport in the atmosphere. Thank you, Liz. Okay. In the meantime, I was also thinking about the other side of the spectrum, right? So aerosols are this multi-scale phenomenon. They have an impact on the large scale, but this impact depends crucially on what they're doing on the small scale. So aerosols are really small. This is 1 micrometer comparison. So there's a lot going on in the sub-micron length scales. And that's a good time to take a deep breath. So everyone taking a deep breath with me now. All right, you can breathe out. So you just now inhaled about 1 million aerosol parts, right? So aerosol parts are all around us, outside and inside. And if you look at them with a microscope, which is something that Daniel is doing, Daniel came here just now from a red-eye flight. So he's here in the wake, I think, right? If you look at the aerosol with the microscope, they look like this. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. So if we talk about dust, it's just one type, right? Or sea salt or biomass burning, what have you. But if you zoom in, there is a lot of detail and a lot of diversity within an aerosol population. And the problem is this really matters if you think about the impacts. if you think about the radiative properties of these aerosols, if you think about how easily they form clouds, if you think about how, if they help nucleating ice crystals in the atmosphere, or if you think about the health impacts. And so I was sort of like grappling with this. There's also a lot of transformations. If you look at this aerosol state, it doesn't stay like this, right? It changes. It's a very dynamic system. As aerosols are transported over some area, you have emissions of aerosols. They're aging, just like us. There's stuff condensing on the aerosols. They're coagulating with others. And with this, the impacts also change. And one of the key things that why it's important is this diversity is really hard to capture in our large scale models that we use to predict climate change. And so this is an iconic figure from IPCC report that shows us the radiative forcing of different radiative forcing agents. And one of them is aerosols. And you notice here that the bar goes to the left, right? So it means that aerosols are actually cooling and partially offsetting the warming done by the greenhouse gases. And you also notice there's a big error bar. It's not actually an error bar in the traditional sense. It's actually a spread of model results, right? So radiative forcing is not a quantity that you can measure. We can only derive it by using models. And the models don't agree, right? So representing aerosol in large scale models requires gross simplifications because we cannot track all this detail, and there's not one way to simplify, right? And so different models do it in different ways, and this causes this spread, which we call structural uncertainty, because the models are structured differently. Okay. And so just to be clear, because I know it's a very also not only diverse aerosol population, but diverse audience here. The aerosol impacts are on climate we can formulate them in these three categories, right? So aerosols are needed to form clouds. They are cloud condensation nuclei. They help form ice at higher temperatures than if they weren't there, and they absorb and scatter radiation. Yeah. Okay, and so now we have to get a little bit technical. How we actually represent aerosols in models. It can be different depending on the application, right? There are very simple models that only track mass concentration of aerosols, and you don't worry about size, right? And so then, as you go to the right, become more and more sophisticated. We carry information about the size of the aerosol, maybe treat them as a collection of overlap distributions, call this the modal models, or we treat them as a number of bins. So these are the sectional models. But what in these models, what you do, you simplify a lot, right? You lump them together. You're not resolving their true diversity, and that's a big limitation, maybe. And the key thing here is actually, if we only have these models, we don't know how big the error is by doing these simplifications, right? It could be big, it could be small, we don't know. And so at that time, when I was working with Sultan on this large scale transport, at the same time, I was thinking about the microphysics, and I realized we actually don't have a model type that gets to this essence or this reason of this big model spread that we see in our global climate prediction. And so I started thinking, actually, what we should do is something like this, right? We shouldn't have distributions where we average out a lot. We should have a more aerosol particles are particles, right? We shouldn't have computational particles that resolve the aerosol population, and then they can evolve individually depending on what they experience. And we have a better way to quantify what errors we are committing by making these simplifications. And so such a model didn't exist at that time. And I was trying things out and things didn't work initially. And so I remember these conversations that I had with Sultan coming into his office. His office was always like this oasis of calm. And he was always, very calm himself. I think he was doing mindfulness before mindfulness was a thing. Right? So that had a very good influence on me as a freaked out assistant professor trying to get my papers published, right? Yeah. One thing I need to explain now a little bit more systematically as well. So this fact that we can arrange aerosol material in different ways over a population that consists of different particles. We call this the aerosol mixing state. So it's the distribution of chemical species across the population. And it can go from one extreme, which we call an external mixture, to the other extreme, which we call an internal mixture. And so what you see here is a collection of particles. They contain really different chemical species, doesn't matter what they are for now. And so in the external mixing case, the different species will reside in different particles, right? So each particle is just one species, and the ratio is half of it is brown. What is this? A third is dark blue, and the rest is light blue, right? And then on the other hand, the internal mixture, each particle looks like the bulk, right? So each particle contains half brown and so on. And so, but these are idealization, right? So in reality, it's probably something in between. And that's part of the reasons why aerosols are so tricky to deal with, right? And so, oops. The particle resolved model essentially does this. So we take our real particles and we replicate them or represent them by computational particles. And then this means we are thinking about the aerosols living in this high-dimensional space, right? We call composition space. And here it's drawn just in terms of 3 dimensions: black carbon, sulfate, and organic carbon. And so each particle has a certain point in this 3-dimensional space. In reality, of course, we have many more species, so that's why I say it's a high-dimensional space. And as the population evolves, these points are moving, right, in this space. And so that's what we are doing. That's how a particle resolved model works conceptually. And then we can think about these different types of models that I introduced. How are they related, right? So if the particle resolved model type actually resolves the high-dimensional composition space, as I just explained, these simplified models that seem like, okay, just other kind of models that we might use, they are actually low-dimensional projections of this high-dimensional space, right? So we can always go from here to here, but when we have a model like this, it cannot go back, right? So there's a lot of ambiguity once you collapse this space down to a smaller number of dimensions, what the aerosols actually look like. And why this matters, if we take an example of aerosol forming clouds, right? So there are chemical species in the aerosol that are better at this, salts, essentially, and other species are not as good as forming cloud droplets. And depending on how you distribute a good cloud condensed nuclei material and a bad cloud condensation nuclear material over the population, this really determines how many cloud droplets you get. And so in an external mixture, it might be that only the salt, so ammonium sulfate, right, for example, forms cloud droplets. So half of your aerosol population would activate from clouds. In an internal mixture, maybe all of them would, because now you're spreading your good CCN material over the entire population. And then in a real world mixture, of course, we are somewhere in between. And so the simplified models that lump them all together, they lose this kind of detail. And this phenomenon of mixing state is one of the unknown unknowns, right? So it's structural uncertainty of the model. And with a particle resolved model, it's called part FC, we can begin to quantify this uncertainty. Okay, so Brian, how much time do I have? Like 2 hours, right?
No comment. You're good to 11:50.
Good, all right. Because I have to explain a little bit about the different types of uncertainty. So, in models, there are a lot of parameters, right? And so oftentimes we actually don't know the exact number of these parameters. So this could be probability of depositing at surfaces for our aerosols or some accommodation coefficient, all these microscale parameters, so they are unknown. How to assess this uncertainty? It's relatively straightforward, even though in practice it's a lot of work. So you vary the parameters and see what comes out, right? How big is this difference for a target quantity? For example, concentration of cloud condensation nuclei or absorption and so on. In practice, this is a lot of work because there are a lot of parameters, and so you have to do a lot of simulations. Sometimes you have these correlation effects, right? So in the group in Leeds with Ken Castle, they developed a really elegant way of assessing this parametric uncertainty for these type of models, and so that's one thing. That's not the thing I'm talking about. I'm talking about structural uncertainty when the underlying model really doesn't fully describe the true system, right? So in our case, we are really interested in these effects of mixing state, the diversity of our particles in a population. And so if a model doesn't resolve that, well, you cannot make any statement how important or not important it is. And so to assess, it's not so easy to assess structural uncertainty. You could compare to measurements if they are available in a way that constrain the effect well enough. That's tricky. Or you compare to a benchmark model if you have one available. And so we didn't used to have one available, but we have been developing this now, essentially over the past 15, 20 years to make such a model available. Okay, so I already mentioned harnessing of particle-soft model. Just to summarize a little bit, so with this type of model, we don't lump particles together in modes or bins. Instead, we have these discrete computational particles. There is a lot of work to do with the aerosol dynamics, right? So that's the part C part, where we sample the population to figure out which particles coagulate, and it's what's happening with all these different processes. So we have been developing methods over many years to do this. But then there is this other part of it. There's also this chemistry going on, right? So aerosol science is essentially a multi-phase chemistry problem. So we have stuff going from the gas phase into the aerosol phase and backwards. And so this is done by a model that was developed by the scientists at T&L. So on each particle, we figure out what's the thermodynamic, not necessarily equilibrium, because we're not assuming equilibrium, but what should go into the aerosol and what's coming out at any given time. And so with this now, the evolution of mixing state is straightforward to represent, but the downside is it's computationally very expensive, as we can imagine. And so the thing I struggled with in these early days, and I was naively literally representing each computational particle represents a real particle, you run into limits very quickly. And so that's when another collaboration started with my husband, who happened to know a lot about stochastic PDEs and helped a lot in the sequence of papers to accelerate the method. Okay, so yeah, and so at that time, people who were there probably remember he was on the West Coast, and so I was doing these red-eye flies on a bi-weekly basis. And so what happened on Mondays, I landed at JFK, drove the car out to here, and then came right away to Sultan's paper class that he was organizing for the grad students. Remember that class? So everyone felt students need to read papers, right? And so Sultan organized this class. It was always like at noon on Mondays, and we had pizza. Remember that? Yeah, so I came from this red-eye flight, and it was a great way to start the week. In case somebody is interested in the underlying governing equations, that's it. I don't think we need to dwell on this. I want to show this So that time, 2005, 2007 was also when I met Daniel. So you joined me 2006, right, or something? Seven.
Interview 2006.
That's right, that's right. And so we are also collaborating to this day. And so, I should remember, I remember another story about Sultan. So he was a very gracious host. And he invited Daniel, do you remember that?
Yes.
With his wife and me, with my husband over to his house. He had a beautiful house, beautiful landscape backyard. I thought when I grow up, I want to have a house like this. I think I'm not grown up yet, not like that yet. And so the thing that happened this evening, I don't know if you remember that, there was this animal running across the lawn. I thought, what is that? And then we got caught up in conversation when we went inside. And I forgot about this. And then we came back, this animal came inside. And it was a hairless cat. So this was the first time I met a hairless cat. And it was Sultan's cat. And he said, oh, it's a very affectionate cat. And it's really good. It doesn't shed. Yeah. And so it curled up on my lap. I have never met a hairless cat after. I had interaction with a hairless cat, but I thought it was really cool. And another thing that I remember was Sultan and his cat. Do you remember that cat?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And the house.
And the house, right?
I still striving for the house.
Okay, and then the other picture here is Jessica, who I don't think he's here yet, but he started out working with me as a master's student and then transitioned to another collaboration working with Daniel now on aerosol science. So lots of connections to Stony Brook. And really the point of this slide is we did a lot of studies in using this particle resolve model as a box model, right? So learning about black carbon, how it's aging, how quickly it's aging, looking at atmospheres chemistry and cloud droplets. Now with Daniel, we're looking at ice nucleation. But at the same time, the box model, when you just look at one parcel of air, right, it's very limiting. And I had another great student, maybe now 10 years ago, so he became a postdoc and is now a research scientist, who implemented our particle resolve model into WRF. So many people in this audience will be familiar with WRF. It's a three-dimensional weather model essentially. And so in each of the grid cells, we now have one of these particle resolve models implemented, and we predict the evolution of what's happening to these particles. And so we had to develop, so that's part of Jeff Curtis's work, the transport algorithms. How do we move the individual particles around? It's different to the scalar transport that we're used to in our 3D particle transport models. The methods converge like they're supposed to. The more particles you say, and it makes it more expensive. The smaller is the error, right? So the convergence is like this, 1 over square root of the number of particles as expected. But the nice thing about this method is that to move the particles, it's only the computation cost is only proportional to how many particles are actually moving from one grid cell to the next, not the total number of particles, which seems like a detail, but it's actually really important to make this work. Okay, with this type of model now, we can do these studies where we say, okay, how important is it really to resolve all the details about composition, right? Is this really important, or can you get away with making very simplifying assumptions? In one case, you could say, let's just average the composition over the whole population so that each particle, they still can have different sizes, but they are composed of the same mixture, right? Which is identical to the bulk. Or we could say, let's assume whatever's in this aerosol is all an external mixture. So we T-average the composition, right? So going between these two extremes. And then you can calculate the error, right? So here, Jeff has been working a lot on how easily the aerosol particles form cloud droplets. And this shows an error. By the way, this is California. This model domain is California, which is the Bay Area. And when you see red, this means an overestimation. So if we assume aerosols are internally mixed rather than doing our best effort, we get an overestimation of 100%, sometimes even more. And that's simply because we are smearing out the good material or the material that easily nucleates droplets over the entire population. And with the external mixture, it's a little bit more complicated to explain what we get. The pattern, sometimes it's an overestimation, sometimes it's an underestimation, but this gives you an idea about the order of magnitude. So it does matter, right? So what you assume, how the particles are what the particles are composed of. And we can do the same exercise for optical properties, right? So if we smush everything together and assume all particles look the same, that would be over here. No, that axis here shows you how internally mixed the whole population actually is. So over here, everything is completely internally mixed. As you go more over here, you get more externally mixed. And on the y-axis is the error in absorption. And so if we assume everything is completely internally mixed and it is actually internally mixed, the error is 0, right? So that's fine. It becomes more interesting when we assume the internal mixture, but it's actually more externally mixed. And so this shows you how big the error is getting in that case. So it's on the order of 80%. And that then, of course, factors into the single scattering albedo, which is important for climate studies. Okay. This may seem strange, but it is very relevant. Yeah, so this elephant is a metaphor for the aerosol, right? And so what this means is depending on which instrument are you using or how you are looking at your aerosol population, you get a different answer, right? Just like with the elephant, if you just look at the track, that's the word I was looking for, you may think it's a snake. Or if you look at the end, the tail, you may think it's a rope. And the whole thing is, of course, an elephant. And the same applies for the aerosol state. So if you have a certain measurement device, you're only looking at black carbon, right? And so they usually only look in certain size ranges. So you get the answer, it's black carbon with some non-absorbing coating, right? But that applies only between 70 and 500 nanometer because that's all the instrument can see. Or you have an instrument that samples the large particles. So you think, oh, this is dust. But actually in the submicron, there's a whole bunch of other things, right? Or you see something about the mixing state and you see, oh, in this size range, it's sulfate and organics and externally mixed. Well, what about the size range outside, right? Yeah, so you get the idea, right? So it's really tricky to actually synthesize the full aerosol state. And that's one of the big challenges in our field. And a new frontier for me, and that again also relates to Sultan, because Sultan was always very interested in learning new things. This topic about my collaboration with him on dust, he wasn't working on aerosols before, right? But he discovered this problem by reading his papers and thought this is interesting, it has a large impact, so I want to work on this, right? And so I think for us now, it's one of the challenges, how can we exploit machine learning techniques to move our field forward? And so there are a lot of attempts, some things are working, some things are not working, but something that I'm grappling with as well. And I want to show at the end here now, the last 10 minutes or so, where we are going with this. And the one question, we can apply this in different ways. The one question I want to talk about today is, given that different instruments see different aspects of the aerosol state, how can we construct a best estimate of the complete aerosol state based on incomplete observations, right? And so this relates to other problems as well. Imagine you have a measurement network that only measures at certain sites, and you want to fill in what's in between, right? Or you want to maybe you have a measurement network that is very dense initially, but you want to take away certain instruments to save money, right? How do you construct like a complete picture from something that is incomplete? And we are applying this to aerosols. Okay, and so the way this works is that it's using so-called generative models, and the training goes like this. So what we need to have, of course, is a true aerosol. Yes. What we need to have is pairs of the following. We need to have pairs of the full observation, which is our aerosol states. This could come from a very expensive measurements where we piece together different instruments to get the best estimate or best measurement, best observation as full as possible, right? In our case, we were using model output, right? Okay, but these are the full observations. So we have, in this case, a size result composition and a size distribution that tends over the entire relevant diameter range. And then we have our partial observations. And so these partial observations are inspired by what certain instruments actually give us. Doesn't matter now what they're called, but it's a size distribution up to a certain range. So size distributions are usually not that easy to measure, so there's usually a cutoff. And then there is information about composition, but only certain species, not like all species, and only bulk, right? So you could conceivably think this is something that you get from one of the arm sites, right? Like the SFTS and that's what they have. And you get these measurements, which is only a partial observation of the true aerosol state. And by pairing these things, we train a conditional generative model that has now this information embedded. And this paper, by the way, we just submitted to this journal on artificial intelligence for device systems. Okay, so then once we've trained this model, how we use it is like this. So we have our partial observations, which we call labels. I had to learn all this lingo, what machine learning people call this. We're calling it labels. So we use our partial observation, we send it through the model, the machine learned model, and we get out a whole bunch of generated aerosol states. So importantly, not just one, because with these labels, we don't constrain the population fully, right? So we can generate as many as we want, and they will be consistent with these labels. And the question is, if I only know these partial information, yeah, by not knowing the full aerosol state, how wrong do I get in my prediction of climate relevant properties, CCN, IMP, and optical properties? Okay, and so the evaluation, so this is now a couple of steps. Bear with me. Works like this. So in reality, we would start with our incomplete observation, our partial observation of the true aerosol. But in our model, of course, we know what we put in, right? So this is what this is. We actually know what the population look like. And then we can compare later, what did this generative model do? How close are we, right? What happens there? Okay, so we start out, we actually know, but we pretend later we don't, right? But we do have that information. From that, we get our partial measurement. And then we generate aerosol states. And here are just 5 samples. Of course, in reality, we have more, like hundreds or 100. So they may look like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What do you notice? Did you say this is good? Something popping out here.
They're not great.
Not great? This is awesome.
No, I meant they're great. They're great.
Oh, they are great.
Oh, yeah.
All right, good. Good answer.
But
But there's something, right?
you're not worried about the bimodal distribution down below and the singular modal distribution.
Someone's having a big sizes, right? So the model makes up these dust, these are dust particles, right? The brown is dust. Probably shown in color, right? The brown is dust. And my labels don't constrain the dust, right? But in the true, when we train the model, it has seen that this was a full, these are full distributions, right? Like including dust and everything else. So it has seen many populations that contain dust, and the dust is usually in the large sizes, right? So it got that right. And so if you measure these distributions, there could be dust, right? It's just that you didn't measure it. And so that's what this model gives you. Here we are comparing the other lines here. So yeah, I think we're comparing how whatever we generated, how does this compare to the label that we put in? And so the lines are very close together, so that's good. Not always, right? So there's a little bit of difference that didn't get it 100% correct. And then we go on to the diagnostics, right? So given that we have a whole bunch of these generated populations now, sometimes, you know, in the coarse mode, because this was a constraint, there are the additional particles, so it's more or less actually right. This is what we put in, right? Yeah. Does this actually matter for our quantities that we're interested in? So CCN this is scattering, this is absorption, and this is IP, force diffraction. And so we're doing very well on the CCN, right? The two lines are on top of each other. There's a little offset here coming from the spinning, which you will see later. There's a little band, scattering is also good. Absorption not so good, and force diffraction also not so good. Why is this? So the absorption hinges mainly on black carbon, right? And so when you do little errors here where you put your black carbon, that introduces these errors. And similarly with the force diffraction, this is about the dust, right? So depending on where you put the dust is really good at nucleating ice, so you will get differences there. And one thing I should mention here, we didn't condition or we didn't weight the black carbon and the dust particularly more than the other species, right? Each species is weighted, and we have a whole bunch of them, it's weighted equally. If we wanted to improve the prediction of absorption and ice nucleation propensity, you could put more weight on these species that it's just a small number of species, and this would become better. And so this is just a summary of everything, all the it means many times, and you see again, this is the CCN fraction. So these are outside outliers here. So maybe on one line, this is from the bin that I mentioned before, depending on here we have this little offset, right? So that's not really worrisome at all. Scattering is really good. Absorption, I already mentioned why that is, and INP or force diffraction similarly. Okay, I think I made it in my allocated 45 minutes. Yeah, so that's my summary here. So really, it's about the theme I sort of like identified for this talk is this structure across scale. So with Sultan, I worked on centers of action and the variability patterns and shape of long range transport. By the way, my first bullet point should have been 20 years go really fast. Somehow I had this feeling and I was remembering these things and oh wow, this is really 20 years ago, but yes. And then I showed you this other work that I've been doing on particle scale structure, how the mixing states, the
distribution of size and composition, how this really impacts aerosol, climate impacts. And then the most recent word about the latent structures of aerosol when this machine learning to infer the hidden relationships from the data. And you know, knowing Sultan as a lifelong learner, I think he would have liked this very much too, because it's just more of the same topic, right? It's covering structure from data and trying to make sense out of a complex system.
Okay, with this, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was actually like the most perfect talk I could have imagined for today. And in the spirit of mentors and students and colleagues, we typically offer the first few questions to some students that are here. So Jacqueline, Anna, and Upal.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was just curious about the aerosol's impact on human health, because you mentioned, like, Rachel, that deep breath inhaled about like 1 million particles.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, about how many particles would we have to inhale to see potential adverse health effects? And along the same veins, would you say aerosols are like bad for humans?
It's not inherently bad, right? So it depends very much on the size. So the bigger ones get stopped in the nose, and the smaller they are, the more deeply they penetrate into the lung. The smallest one very deep, and then they get taken up by the bloodstream. And it's not just respiratory illness, but also other illnesses that can be caused by being in the bloodstream. I do know there is no, even though the EPA has thresholds for PM2.5 and PM10, right? There are studies that say there is no lowest limit when you can say aerosols are actually, they don't matter, right? So in some sense, you could say it's inherently bad to inhale them because there is no lowest threshold. How long do we have to inhale them until, how many do we have to inhale? Like multiply 1 million by I don't know how many years. I would say it's a lot, and it depends on lots of things, right? I have a colleague at Illinois who really works on the toxicology, like what makes the particles really toxic, right? We worry a lot about sulfate, but he's telling me it's not really, it's just correlated to whatever causes the health impact, and I'm not the person to speak to this, but yeah, so maybe the short answer is there is no safest lower limit, but on the other hand, it does take a long time. These are these long time health impacts, right? After many years. But on the other hand, I mean, you do see short-term effects during these episodes with wildfires, right? That the visits to the emergency room go up. So there are these short adverse health impacts as well. So yeah, that's a bit of a long-winded answer. Maybe.
All right. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very impressive. So my question is related to ocean-generated aerosols. Given that there are too many types like biological, mineral, and sea salt, they come to different types and size. So is there any specific types of modification required in the model to deal with to capture what varieties of ocean-generated aerosols?
So you're talking about how the species of the aerosols?
No. So ocean-generated aerosols, there are different types like biological, like sea salt. So is there any modification required in the model to deal with or to capture such wide varieties of ocean or ocean aerosols?
Okay. Depends on which model, of course, right? Like when we say model, there are so many different models, they do it in different ways. But how we represent ocean-generated aerosol is it's mainly like a solution of sea salt, maybe other inorganic species, and then there also would be some organics, right? So in our model, for example, we represent it with mainly sea salt. They can take up water, and then there is some ocean organic component that forms a film, but they're not very specific what these organics are, which of course for some people is very important, right? Like what's the speciation of the aerosol? So we make that simplification that we say it's just generic organic without going into the detail what kind of organic. Becky?
Yes, thank you for your talk. I was really interested to learn about like more aerosols and atmospheric sciences. I don't really come from like an atmospheric background, so like maybe my question a bit open-ended. But you're talking about like earlier, like studies that Sophie did about like dust like variation and settlement and like and different modeling, like where do you think like the future of aerosol studies will go to like towards now? Like what's the most important? That's what I focus on.
The future of aerosol research, ooh, that's the big question. So on the one hand, I think we are getting better and better with this on the micro scale. Like we have learned so much, right? Even comparing 20 years ago, right? The work that Daniel has been doing, like what actually is in the aerosol and what are the properties, and so we drill into more and more detail there. But on the other hand, I think we're also getting better with simplifying, right? And so I think this machine learning route, they and I'm including myself, but also because we are working on this, they're onto something. Because what's happening? Wait. Oh, back to yeah. So when we use our simplified models, we are basically handcrafting. We're thinking, okay, so this population, there's some dust, there's some sea salt, and with other things. So 3 moles are probably enough, right? So based on our intuition or our background knowledge, constructing these low dimensions, right? And it's kind of like handmade, and we hope for the best and wave our hands a little bit when we do this. Now with the machine learning techniques, we are actually able to discover these reduced low dimensional spaces in a more rigorous way. And then you have to figure out how to evolve it, right? We are not there yet, but I think this is where we should be going, and what certainly should be tried and is being tried. Like constructing these low dimensional models, and we need them because this is too expensive, right? We can't run this in a global simulation for many, many years. So we need some sort of like simplified models. It's just the ones that we have right now, they have limitations and drawbacks. And so I think we can do better. So yeah. Chapter.
So I agree with Mary, perfect for this occasion. Really nice talk. So your talk sort of starts out with the notion that the impacts of aerosols are highly dependent on chemical composition and mixing state and size. It's all very complex, but occasionally the atmosphere, because the composition is temporally very dynamic, the atmosphere sometimes might be doing us a favor. So for example, around here in the summertime, the aerosol composition might be ammonium sulfate and some sea salt and some biogenic oxidation products. And then in a couple hours later, it's overwhelmingly dominated by biomass burning, aged biomass burning aerosol. Well, unfortunately, the thermodynamics is changing at the same time, but it seems like observations of the properties and the impacts of aerosols might tell us a whole lot. So just give us some comments on how good we are at making use of real-time observations of aerosols in there.
I think so. Yeah, observing the aerosol and its composition and how it changes. Having these online instruments, which didn't used to exist in the last century, right? So this aerosol mass spectrometer, it has been a game changer where we actually can actually get size result of composition. Not all species, but a certain subset of species. And we can get this, we don't have to go to the lab and analyze these samples. We get this online, right? So lots of measurements. So this has been really a game changer in terms of learning, putting these instruments out there in different environments and learning what's in there, right? And so the surprise, I think, was now 25 years ago, there's a lot of organics in there, right? That you consider, and then there's this big new field like secondary organic aerosol and all what is associated with it. Now, how good are we in exploiting these measurements? I think what is missing is the synthesis of different instruments to construct the whole aerosol state. And that's really the key because you need many instruments to put together, which is like a logistical, as you know, doing field observation is a logistical challenge. They all have to work, these instruments, even if you get the PIs together. And then doing synthesis, I mean, we tried it, Daniel, we tried it at the, if you're studying it at the FGP. It's really difficult, and I don't think we're there yet. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. This was great, and I'm sure Sultan will love it. So my question goes back to your machine learning. When you do the label, is this supervised? Are you forcing the gaps? You are creating the gaps in the label, right? Or that's the part that is quite.
Okay, so the labels. The labels are in what we choose here is inspired what actually people measure, right? In real life.
So it's not automatic, it's a supervised.
Yeah. Yes. And so we need to give in this training process, we need to pair the labels, which are the partial observations, which we can conceivably get in reality, with the full state, which is much harder to get. It would be a lot of work to do this with actual measurements, which is like to demonstrate, to actually try it out and demonstrate the prototype. We use model data, right? And so you need to tell this machine learning model, this goes with this, and this goes with this, right? So, and then it's I don't know what the method is, but it's one of these generative models. The trick here is you can't just have it to memorize, right? It needs to generate plausible populations. And so, yeah, that's the idea.
Essentially, it's a foundation.
Wow.
Obviously, you showed the IPCC diagram. The big question mark is indirect aerosol cloud effects on climate. And I was when they first started putting that in, I figured it would be all over the place. And now there appears to be convergence. Is that a real convergence or a convergence or
So I would
knowledge-based convergence?
So if you look at I actually should do this one time, like the IPCC reports. There are these different inclinations, right? Every 3 years you get a new one. This is the latest one. And it looks like this. It doesn't look very converged to me. And if you look at the earlier ones, it's actually similarly. Right? It hasn't really changed over the.
But I was surprised it's all on one side of zero.
Oh, yes.
Used to be on both
It's an optimistic view.
Yeah, right.
Maybe I should be so. Good point. Point well taken. Yeah.
I don't think we have any other questions. Thank you so much for this really wonderful talk.